Great.
No, bugger, you're right. But you can't hear him at all?
Not through that. Yeah. Hold on. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and go live. Hanson, could you go hit the thing?
You are live.
Go live.
You're live.
Oh, we're live? Oh, okay, great.
You've been live for like 30 seconds.
Oh, good. Okay.
I'm glad the camera's not pointed at me. Oh, and you've already got a viewer and a thumbs up. Like 30 seconds.
Oh, good. Okay.
The camera's not pointed at me. Oh, and you've already got
Okay, fantastic. Okay. Why is it only showing me?
It only shows whoever's talking.
Oh, does it? Oh, okay. Okay, I didn't think about this. We can't use the microphone because it uses the speaker. Yep. Well, this is the first time I've collaborated with someone where I actually talked to them. So, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 15th century fashion Q&A. I'm here live with Philip from Irish Medieval History, and we're here to answer all of your questions about 15th century fashion from Florence through to Ireland. It's up. Okay. Why can't I hear anyone? So Philip, I can't actually hear you at all, which is curious. Oh. Okay, now I can hear you, sort of. Although barely. That's interesting. Why on earth can I barely hear you on my phone, which has a ridiculously loud speaker? Okay, well, this is the first time I've done a collab with someone else who is talking, so there might be some technical hurdles to overcome this morning. Yeah, so thankfully, for those who, it doesn't seem like we have many viewers yet, so that's okay. Let me see if I can figure out this sound thing. Maybe if I do it from here. Yeah, I'll pick up the sound from here. No.
I can try my...
No. There is a lag there. I love technology. Modern technology is exactly why I love medieval living history. Okay, so for those of you who are here in the live stream, we're going to see if maybe using headphones will help.
Can you still hear?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, now. Great. We might need to scoot that a little closer. I feel like I'm being pulled towards the inexorable well of gravity that is my phone. Okay.
Left and right limits don't change too much.
Great. Okay. So I actually have some questions I've collected from people who weren't necessarily certain whether they could be here or not. And it's very curious that I can only see myself. That's, well, technology doing its thing once again. I don't know what YouTube is on about. So last week we did a collab video on Florence in the early 15th century as through the lens of an Irish delegation from the Fitzgeralds that actually went to Florence in the 14 teens. And we discussed fashion in Florence and Florence as it would have been experienced by this Irish delegation. And then this week we set up this Q&A to answer any questions that may have arisen as a result of that or in the intervening week. So Philip, were there any what sort of questions did you get on your end? I think there were actually some questions about the connection between the Fitzgeralds and the Gherardini and why the Fitzgeralds even went to Florence in the first place. Right. Right. So it's very interesting. I was just about to ask you what sort of goods would the Irish have had on offer to export, and of course I thought it was possibly sheep. It was possibly wool. English wool was known for having a really long staple, and it's one of the reasons that English wool was so highly valuable on the continent. Was were the Do you know if the sheep in Ireland had the same kind of really luxurious long staple wool that was so coveted? Of course. Right, right. So, yeah, I can absolutely see then why Florence would have been keenly interested in Ireland. Florence is a flourishing economy that is based on banking and wool. And so it would have been absolutely in the Gherardini's interest to establish trade connections with any part of Ireland that could provide them with that kind of luxury grade wool as a raw material. So that, yeah, that makes total sense. Right. Right. Yeah, yeah, Mona Lisa Gherardini was, yeah, a member of that clan. And the story of that painting is an interesting one because most people don't realize that Leonardo started it, and then he did he did one version, a much earlier version, they think now, when she was very young, and he didn't finish it. And then he came back and he finished it years later when she was older. And that's why there are two. At first, they thought there was one version, and then there was a hoax version, and then they started actually analyzing and dating the so-called hoax version, where she looks so much younger, and they realized that actually it dates to the right time, and it would make sense that because Leonardo was ADHD, he couldn't finish anything, um, so he had a really bad habit of starting projects and then walking away when they started to bore him. Yeah. Oh, Oh, wow. We just had a super thanks. Thank you, KT Rainbow. That's really generous of you. Um, yeah, so did you have any questions that any other questions under the video about the video we did about Ireland and Florence? Right. Right. Yeah. So it's very interesting what happens in France in the sort of second half of the 14th century. The Valois take power from the Capetian dynasty, and the Valois. You have one of the Valois, the first Valois Duke of Burgundy is Philip the Fearless, and his brother is the King of France, and so he sets about turning Burgundy into a power center because he didn't get France, he didn't get the kingdom, he got a duchy. And I think at some level he decides, well, I'm going to make this a kingdom. I'm going to start that process. And so through a series of dynastic marriages and intermarriages and traditional lands, around Dijon, and they look to the north and realize that the economic powerhouse is the Low Countries, is Flanders, right? And so, because of a series of accidental deaths and women, no male heir having been left in this county or that county, Burgundy ends up consolidating a lot of power and spreading its wings across the Low Countries. And that's why, they kind of move their capital from Dijon, even though it's still the sort of emotional capital of Burgundy. They move really and set up base in the Low Countries, in Ghent, in Bruges. And because of that economic power, they that comes with financial power, and that allows them to start really expanding from a just kind of any duchy to this amazing state that is so highly organized with all these different levels and different offices, and they start really styling themselves as royalty, even though they're technically just royal peers, right? Burgundy was one of the royal peers of France. There were seven, I think. Um, and so they have the funds, they have the resources, and they start turning themselves into this magnificent court. Philip the Good really takes John the Fearless starts the path down that, but as you know, in the 14 teens, he gets assassinated after assassinating the Dauphin. Philip the Good takes over. Philip the Good is the one who Burgundy into this center of art and culture and fashion that kind of belays its military dominance, but the military dominance was absolutely there. And Burgundy had a highly organized military, right? He issues all of these ordinances to organize every unit at every level, and that each man at arms should have this kind of thing, and if he's an archer, then he should have this gear, and that sort of level organization extends across the entire Burgundian organization. So that really, having control of Flanders, of this, the kind of economic heart of Europe, of Northern Europe especially, with all of its ports and all of its weaving factories, hand woven but still factories, as medieval people would have understood them. That allows them to just become the powerful heart of Europe. And through their continued dynastic, arrangements, the Philip the Good marries Isabella of Portugal, and she's an infanta of Portugal. She's a Portuguese princess. Um, that just opens up the door to really allow all of this power to consolidate under the House of Burgundy, under the Valois Burgundian dukes. And the second you have economic power, the second you've got all the flash and glory of culture, everyone's turns their eyes to you. And that's how Burgundy becomes the big fashion influencer that, in the Iberian Peninsula, fashions in in amongst the royal houses are highly, but the men really started doing very, very Burgundian fashions with, the heavy fur-lined woolen overgarments with the pleats, sometimes short, sometimes full, and impressive sleeves, and the tall head felted wool caps that are so iconic in many of the portraits from this era. And that trickles on up through England and up to Scotland, and you can read it in the inventories and the expense accounts. It's the exact same fabrics, it's the exact same linings. The Royal House of Scotland, they have more fur than Burgundy does, but that's because it's colder. Um, in so I'm wearing right now. I'm actually wearing the basically my Burgundian underwear. This is a kirtle. I've got a smock on, but this is what ladies would wear underneath those massive gowns that you see in the portraits and in the altarpieces. And so I would actually put a panel across this called a stomach in Scots English. Or a placard in a stomacher in English, and then I think it's called a placard in French. In the Scottish royal household, they lined their placards in fur because you wanted every extra. I'm assuming because it's cold in Edinburgh in the winter, and we're entering the little ice age, and so it's even colder than it is now. And I'm assuming that you want every extra layer of warmth that you can get without having to bundle on a big bulky cloak. Because honestly, people love cloaks. Modern people love cloaks. They think they're flashy and they're impressive to look at, but really. But if you want to actually do tasks and you're sitting in, your castle, which yes, it's got a maybe it has a fireplace, although I'm not certain when Scotland got fireplaces actually. Um, but maybe it just has a brazier or a fire in the center of the room, and so you need to make sure your clothes are warm. Right, right, right. Right, because, but most people don't realize is that fireplaces are actually an innovation of the 12th century in Europe. The kind in the sense of you have a fireplace in the wall with a chimney instead of just a fire in the center of the floor with a hole in your roof, right? But most people didn't have them in their homes. Your average person, so the castle's having them, that's a luxury item. But even still, you have a chimney at each end of, say, a great hall. There's a lot of space in between those 2 chimneys that isn't, directly heated. Radiant heat only goes so far. So you're still going to want your layers to be warm enough that you can function and do all the things you need to get done in your day without being burdened by a, big bulky cloak. So, yeah, right. Uh, Yeah, it's done. It's done. It's like London in 1665 or 1666, yeah. So I just wanted to there are a couple the question is, it's not fashion, it's, have I eaten pottage? It's actually a 15th century food question. Um, pottage, is yeah, no doubt you had pottage in Ireland. Pottage pottage is, for those who don't know, is a stew. And pottage is made from whatever is available in the season. And so in my living history life, I've eaten a lot of pottage. But the great thing about pottage is that it changes with the season and it's based on what's available at the time. So it's you could eat pottage every day and not get bored of it because it'll be a different kind of pottage every day. Yeah, and I'm assuming in Ireland at this point you still had lots of sheep. It was before the Tudors came and probably destroyed all of your sheep stock. So you'd have you'd have lamb in the spring and then you'd have mutton in the autumn, right? Before you go right, right. What a happy time. Well, it's funny how there's a tradition of hospitality, the world, in fact, that is contract that you will behave if you come into my home and I will provide you with hospitality and you will not steal from me and you will not kill us in our sleep. And um, there's a one yeah, it was definitely a different time. Northern Italy doesn't, in Florence anyway, doesn't have that kind of hospitality because the Italians are paranoid. Um, and and with good reason. Now, at the level of peasants, that might be a different thing. You can actually, if you read, and actually, I just need to pause because someone just said I can't hear the other person talking. So, for anyone else who's viewing, can you hear both of our voices or only me? Let me know in the live chat if you can, guys. Um, while we wait for that answer, I'll hold forth a little more about Boccaccio's Decameron. So, for those who don't know, there's this fantastic 14th century collection of Italian folk tales called Il Decamerone, the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Netflix recently produced a terrible series that has nothing to do with Boccaccio's Decameron in any way, shape, or form. And the clothing, I'm going to be doing a review. It is chef's kiss bad. Um, but in the story, these are mostly about middle class people. There's a few tales of daring do and adventure that are about knights or kings and queens, but most of them are just your average common, middle class Italian merchant or maybe a farmer or a strangers have been invited, strangers in quote, by the way, usually it's someone's lover who's been invited in under the guise of being a visitor. That you end up with, a whole group of people in the same room sharing beds, and then in the darkness, shenanigans ensue because of mistaken identity, but because everyone's trying to stay quiet because no one wants anyone else to know what's going on, no one confirms the other person's identity actually, and then in the morning no one really realizes that they haven't spent the night with the person they thought they did. So I think probably at the lower echelons of Italian society, there in the 14th century, there is still this idea of hosting a traveling person, because just like in Ireland, how you had the itinerant tradesmen, tinkers. Most people don't realize a tinker was actually a person who would come and fix your pots, right? They'd patch your pots, and they traveled because you only need so many pots patched at a time. So you had your tinkers and your peddlers and whatnot, and they would go around from village to village or around the cities, and they would need places to stay. Yeah. So a comment about the Decameron. I tried to read the Decameron so many times, but I loved watching the 70s film. Oh, a 70s film. I wanted to read the Decameron in Middle English, but then decided, oh, well, it's Italian anyway. Yeah. Yeah, you can read Chaucer in Middle English, which is interesting. If you can read it phonetically, it becomes much more understandable. Yeah, the Decameron is written in Italian and was a who was an English Italian, actually. And he was natively bilingual, because he had one parent who was Italian, I'm assuming his mother, and one parent who was English. And he did a whole passel of translations. And I think he produced the first English-Italian dictionary, bilingual dictionary. And his version of the Decameron is written in Shakespearean style English, and it is hysterical. Can highly recommend, because it's filled with delightful, obscure, obsolete English words that just add so much flavor to the stories. So yeah, can recommend. It's a great way to get an idea of medieval life. Yeah, so then the other question I have was, what is my most elaborate outfit, or what is our most elaborate outfit? So my most elaborate outfit is, it depends on what you mean by elaborate. In terms of number of hours it took to sew it, hands down, my Burgundian overgowns with their 10-foot trains and every single seam hand sewn and linings and everything. I think there's probably 200, 300, 400 hours of stitching went into those. Um, the most elaborate one I have is actually, oh, I think Ryan, are you asleep? Could you bring me the dragon dress? Yellow one with the black dragons? My most elaborate one was one I made for a coronation in a medieval organization of which I'm part. I was being crowned, and it is whole thing. And I literally had probably 50 people helping me sew this dress. I went to a week-long camping, medieval living history camping event, and we all sat around. The dress is so big that you could actually have like 5, 6 people working on it at once. And we would just sit around and applique these silk dragons. Yeah. So this, right, got it. Okay, just you can hand it to me. Okay, so this is probably, oh, the kitty's water dish, right? Okay, so this is probably, um, not the best line for it. This is probably my most elaborate one. I have to rework the shoulders. The shoulders were not tailored properly. Anyway, yeah, so all of these dragons, they're not painted on, they're not stenciled on, they're not woven into the fabric, they are hand appliqued. And I had to stencil them all myself and cut them out by hand myself. And then I appliqued them on with the help of a lot of people. So this is probably my most elaborate in terms of the amount of labor that went into it. Um, it's funny, the word elaborate is kind of open to interpretation, whether you mean fanciest or most labor intensive. Sometimes the most labor intensive garments are actually not the fanciest and vice versa. Yeah. Um, yeah, what about you? Philip, what's your fanciest, your most elaborate ensemble? Yeah, that's what I'm trying to just me. Oh, really? Well, I apologize. YouTube has apparently failed utterly today on the technology front. I don't know why we can't hear Philip. Okay, that is highly irritating. Uh, yeah, literally the problem I've had before is actually collaborating with myself and my own sound feeding back into my microphone. So I know there should be sound coming from the second from you. Well, while you look into that, I'll answer this question. Um, Let me see. Oh, where am I located? So I am currently located in Korea, and Philip, my interlocutor, whom I guess everyone thinks I've been talking to myself now, is actually in Japan. So we are here in Asia, but I travel the world to do living history, and including Thailand, Korea, Europe, America. There are week-long events, medievalist events, kind of all over Europe and America. The one I was talking about with the dragon dress was actually in Sweden, and that happens every year around Ascension Day weekend. And then there's a 2-week event I attend at the end of July, going into August, called Penzic in Western Pennsylvania, and that's a 10,000 person medievalist event. And I go there and have my immersive medieval encampment and teach and lead dance and have balls and go to parties and make medieval dancing happen and where it might otherwise not happen. If you travel enough to attend a medieval living history event every weekend your entire Oh my gosh. I am so sorry, everyone, that the conversation has been one way. Philip was saying some very interesting things. I was just looks like I was just staring at the camera. Well, we'll do this again and we'll figure out the technology. Uh, Comment is come to Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is absolutely on my list of places to visit. I want to go and spend a week riding and living in yurts out on the steppes in Kazakhstan. That is seriously a dream of mine. Kazakhstan looks beautiful. It is definitely on my list of places to visit. And I can be hired to come and lead medieval dance or teach medieval fashion anywhere in the world. So if you want me to come and make that happen, I can do that. um, Comment, I didn't know there was interest in medieval history in South Korea and Japan. Oh, yes. So Japan actually is interesting because historical European martial arts has kind of took root there about 20 years ago. So there's a whole group of people doing ostensibly medieval style combat in up in the Tokyo area for certain in Japan. And in Korea, the same thing has happened, but there's also Koreans are very interested in sort of the romance of medieval history and medieval European fashion. They're almost more interested in European medieval history than in their own their own history. So now affluent enough that people have the time and they have the exposure that they're interested in, reliving the beautiful aspects of medieval agriculture, not some of the more alarming ones like medical treatments. Let's see. Week-long medieval camp is indeed a lot of fun. I have on this channel, if you go and look up my Penzic playlist, you can see exactly what it's like. You can also see what it's like when it just doesn't stop raining for multiple days. It becomes like Ireland. It becomes boggy and very, very. You get a sense of the realism of living life in a campaign encampment. And just like the Irish did at times, when it rains and you're doing a medieval living history encampment and it rains enough, you do stop wearing shoes and you stop wearing stockings. You give up. You just give up and walk around barefoot in the summer because it's warm enough and you can do that. You give up on shoes because you don't want to destroy your leather shoes. And even if you have pattens, sometimes the mud gets deep enough that it doesn't matter. uh, do we have muck mules? By muck mule, do you mean a mule that carries you through the muck, or is a muck mule a tool with which I'm unfamiliar? In most of these events, there are not livestock because, um, especially the 10,000 person event, you don't want people. It's yeah, it's problematic. There are living history events where they do have horses and people do actually ride around. I have not attended one where horses were used as a form of conveyance. I've only attended ones where they were used for jousting or just for kind of riding around in a leisurely sort of way. Yeah. Oh, the muck mule, the 3-foot shoe to wade through the mud stewage in the streets. Oh, so muck mules, right? Talking about clogs. Yeah. So I have patents and I have Chopin's platform shoes. Handsome, are you asleep? Could you find the PNLA? Yeah. So I do have 15th century reproduction platform leather overshoes called Pianelle in English. They're called Chopins sometimes, or in Italian, they're called Chopins sometimes in English. And we actually made them ourselves. They're replicas of a pair that belonged to Beatrice d'Este, who was one of these great Renaissance princesses, one of these erudite women rulers. She was the Duchess of Milan and she married into the Sforza clan at the end of the 15th century. And her Pianelle have actually survived. And they survived in pretty good condition. And so we made a pair during the plague that replicates or somewhat closely replicates hers. They're not an exact replica, but they're pretty close. They're inspired by. And they actually have a core of cork, which you can only get in Spain, by the way. Cork is a specific kind of oak tree, and it's the bark of the oak tree. And then let the trowing wing. So they've got a nice core of cork, and it's kind of like clouds. And these I actually have a video on spending a whole day exploring Florence in 15th century clothing, wearing these in all the different Florentine medieval and Renaissance spaces, including gardens with mud. And I tested these by walking through mud puddles in my attire, and they work perfectly. They are excellent for mud puddles. Um, but what they're not good for is uneven terrain. You will turn your ankle if you wear these on uneven terrain. So they are good for relatively flat surfaces. They are good for mud. They are not really fantastic for climbing up and down steep hills. You will slip out of them literally because they're open in the back. And going downhill, your toes kind of jam into the toe caps. There are kinds without toe caps where it's just a strap. And that might have fewer issues of the jamming issue if you're going up and downhill. And these are particularly tall, like 4.5, 5 inches tall. So there are sort of shorter ones, but yeah, these work great for mud as long as the mud is relatively flat. And you can actually, what's interesting is because I've worn these enough, they've started to wear, and they're starting to look exactly like Beatrice's extant pair here in the sole. Like the exact kind of wear that we see here is the kind we see in hers. So that was a very interesting living history experiment. So yeah. Okay, so common question. Irish question. What did the common Irish of the time wear? Uh, Gosh, yeah, that's a good question. So, Philip, if you if you tell, I'll tell them. I mean, I kind of have an idea, but you're actually the expert. So, right. Is that so? So is that the one? So there are bog finds for those who don't know. Ireland is covered in bogs, and people either end up thrown into them sacrificially early on, or for reasons that yeah, they're murdered, or they, things bad things happen and people drown, right? But because the bog mud is anaerobic, uh, tissue survives actually. So wool especially does well, and human tissues do well as also. So they often they keep finding bodies in bogs in Ireland that have historical and sometimes ancient or medieval clothing intact on them. So uh, there is a bog find, and Philip, I'm just telling people since they can't hear you, I don't think. There's multiple bog finds. Wait, still can't hear Philip. Yeah. Okay. So there are multiple bog finds, and across thousands of years of history actually. And he's talking about one and that dates to the 15th century, I think. If it's the one, yeah, yeah. So it looks, yeah, it's a dress like this, but I think it has long sleeves, if I recall correctly. Yeah. So we're talking about women. So, and this dress, it has long sleeves and it's got buttons on the arm sleeves and it's got buttons down the front. And yeah, so a woman would have worn that. She would have worn a linen smock like this under it because let me tell you, you don't want to have wool against your skin. Uh, the monastic communities wore wool or hair shirts against their skin as a form of purifying the flesh, but that's not something normal people would have wanted to do. um, yeah, so yeah, common women in the 15th century in Ireland would have been wearing something like this with a thing like this on their head, either a linen wrap, like a turban kind of thing, or a coif like this. And then for the men, Philip, what were the men wearing? Right, 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 right. Yeah, yeah. The Scottish, yeah. Mute who made him a mute. Yeah, Philip. So just so everyone knows, Philip is not my imaginary friend. He's real. So I'll just convey what he just said. So, Ireland, of course, everyone has to understand Ireland is not a monolith in the Middle Ages. And so there are different regions and there are different political regions and there are different dominions and different parts of Ireland have different connections with different parts of Europe and different parts of England. So Philip was just saying that in the Southwest, you have this connection with Bristol thanks to the trade routes. And of course, you also have Richard II from England is campaigning in Ireland, in the latter part of the 14th century. And so in the southwest of Ireland, because of those connections, southeast, sorry, southeast. I was wondering, I'm like, that's an interesting jump. Okay, southeast of Ireland, that's okay. Southeast of Ireland, there is a connection, cultural connection to England, and that also comes across in its fashion. And Philip, do you think that's at all levels of society? Is your average peasant or your average man-at-arms dressing themselves, your average henchman, as they say in the inventories of the time, the expense accounts, are they dressing also, obviously not in this sort of elaborate fashion, but at the basic silhouette level, are they also kind of dressing in the English fashion, do you think? Right. 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 Ah, right. 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 So let me convey that. So the oh, thank you, KT Rainbow. Have a lovely day. One of our viewers is leaving. Okay, so in the southeast we have in the northwest, Scottish, and actually, there's a great manuscript for those who don't know called or and it's a manuscript called the Scotochronicon, and it actually depicts Scottish people in the 15th century in 15th century style fashions, as worn in Scotland, and also there's a depiction of an Irish poet from the 15th century. Well, the poet isn't from the 15th century, but he's depicted in 15th century fashions, and the clothes in which this Irish bard are depicted match almost exactly. It was uncanny actually when this works out with a bog find from Northwest Ireland, the Kilkenny or Kilkerry. Kilkerry, the Kilkerry find. If you look up the Kilkerry find, it's you honest to God, you look at this thing and you think it was made yesterday. It went, it went into the bog pretty new. um, and based okay, so so apparently, according to Philip, this poor man, based on the forensics, they think he tried taking a shortcut and ended up sinking into the bog. I'm sorry, it shouldn't make me laugh, but that seems like such a that is such a quintessentially Irish thing to do. I'm going, we're about to do a test. Okay.
Let Philip talk.
Okay, Philip, could you go ahead and try talking? Okay. Okay, so we're doing a sound test. Dear viewers out there, uh, yes, the ancestors got around. Um,
Because I can hear him.
yeah. Well, I can hear him through the phone, so I mean I could hear him in my headphones. So yeah, so those of you who are watching, please let us know if you can hear what we're discussing.
I'll go to the other room and
Oh,
turn on that.
okay. Yeah, right. Ryan's gonna log in from my cameraman, sound man, wardrobe man, props man is going to go into the an alternate studio space and see if he can pick up sound. While I wait to hear the response on that, What I'll tell people is that this outfit, the Kilkerry man, his outfit is basically it's chausses, which are like long stockings, bias cut. They're wool. His are, and they're plaid. I think like brown and yellow, kind of that kind of plaid. And they would hook into either a belt or to brays. Brays are kind of a linen. They look like linen boxers, basically. And then over top of that, he was wearing this wool coat, what is basically a coat hardy in French. It's called a, either a coat or a robe in the English sources, COTE, not COAT, or ROBE, or a gown sometimes in the English sources. And it kind of goes down to his knees and it's buttoned down the front and open kind of from mid thigh down. And then he's got this what I assume is a brat because it's a wool wrap, right? Yeah. So yeah. Can Philip talk again? Can you go ahead and give it another try? Yeah. Anyone? Can anyone? Ryan? Nope. Okay. That is supremely annoying. Ryan is trying to troubleshoot it. Did you Google?
Googled the hell out of it.
Yeah.
There's no thing about sound audio issues.
It's
There's no way to get into the settings from here.
Yeah, I have no idea why on earth a default setting would be to have your collaborator be on mute. That makes no sense whatsoever. Unless it's a setting on your end. Oh, why is there a light on? Right. It's okay. Well, it's also a little strange that your camera is not showing up at all either. So that's all very weird. I guess I'm going to have to play with the settings some more to figure out what on earth is going on here. Yeah, I can hear him just fine.
Oh, did you plug it back in
Well,
when I
yeah.
asked you to talk?
No, 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 no. No, I just now plugged it back in. No, yeah. Okay, yeah. So that's basically what, the average people in Ireland would have been wearing at the time. And at the upper echelons, I assume, Philip, that we're talking about, in the southeast, it's definitely they're imitating either the English or the Burgundians because, basically like very, very, very styles that are not Burgundian. The English start wearing stomachers. The men actually start wearing stomachers across their doublets, their pourpoints, because and usually they're velvet. Usually silk velvet was the velvet mostly of the time, although there was wool velvet as well. So they're wearing these stomachers down across their lacing, and then over top of that, they're usually wearing, or even under the lacing sometimes, depending. Um, and then over top of that, they're wearing a gown, which is, the big heavy overgarment that could be belted in various kinds of pleats. And I assume that they were doing that in England and not in other parts of Europe because it's getting colder in England than it is in other parts of Europe. And they decided they needed to cover that gap in the lacing on their pour points to keep the cold air out. Right. Right. So let me share that with viewers. So apparently, in the in the earlier part of the 15th century, there's supposed to be, a war on, and the the Fitzgeralds and the Butlers, right, decide that they're going to hop on a boat as one does and go over and visit, their cousins in England, and then they just come back, even though they're supposed to be fighting a war. They go on this, I guess, this pleasure trip, and 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 then and then go back again. The point of that is that, of course, the connections obviously between the two islands, which are right next to each other, are pretty close. And it's true. Philip said something earlier that none of you could hear. um, that you've got ships and you've got massive open waters, and it's really fast, relatively speaking, and easy to take a ship up and down the coast or around the coast from one coast to the other, because the waters in the Isle of the the channel that's between the two islands, the damn it, the Manx Channel. What is that channel called between Ireland and, yeah, the Irish Sea? Yeah, it's pretty calm. Those waters are generally pretty calm. So, it's really easy to get around by those who don't understand what traveling by land was. It was rough. There are maybe some remnants of Roman roads that aren't looking so hot anymore, and there's mostly dirt roads, and they're muddy and they're filled with holes, and it's not easy. It's fast to go by horse, relatively speaking, but if you have a baggage train, or you're traveling by cart, it's slow going and uncomfortable. So ship is always the winner. Yeah, that totally tracks. Fraud, waste, and abuse are not new concepts in the world. So for those who couldn't hear, Philip was just relating how at least two separate Irish clans requested grants of money from both of them from the Crown of England. Is that right? Right. So the two across the centuries, various Irish heads of Irish clans have received monies from the Crown of England for either infrastructure improvements, and instead of using that money to, say, build a bridge, they used it to either purchase more supplies, or in the case of the 16th century grant, to actually buy arms, guns and ammunition to then use in the wars against the English, which I think is a brilliant stroke. Yeah, so to the question of fashion, I actually have a question that comes up often, is art, using art as a resource for getting an idea of what clothes look like, right? Because there's sort of the trinity for, if you're doing research into pieces, iconographic, um, and archaeological, right, extant pieces. So if we're lucky, you can hit all three for one kind of garment, and that's the trifecta. Uh, Often, though, you only have you're lucky if you're lucky you have two of those three, and sometimes you just have one of those three sources. So art tends to be the fallback because it's visual, it's the easiest for us, our brains, to interpret. And so a lot of people will find a piece of art and then they will make whatever the garment is in that piece of art. But that's very dangerous on the mainland. Irish, why is there, what happened to all of the Irish altarpieces? Did Ireland at some point in more recent history suffer some kind of iconoclasm where they destroyed all of their medieval artwork as some kind of religious gesture, or right, of course. Oh, Jesus. Right. Right. They thought they were getting a blow in for the good guys, but they were, yeah. So for those who couldn't hear Philip, so one of the things that's always baffled me, um, and now I've got my answer, and I should have kind of guessed what the answer was, is that there's not very much artwork that has survived from medieval Ireland. That's why you will notice there's never a section, a post first millennium, a post year 1000 section in history books on Irish art, right? It's all the Book of Kells. That's you look up Irish art, it's always the Book of Kells. And that's because, starting with Henry VIII, there was a series of iconoclasms where, especially religious artwork or anything that was ostensibly very Irish was destroyed on purpose. And then Cromwell comes in. God bless the Puritans. Destroying shit. Anyway, so for that, for Irish clothing, then you don't really have much in the way of where people keep their clothes bodies very conveniently. It's it's all good. But even when you do have art, and the Scotichronicon, we'll talk about the Scotichronicon actually. For those who don't know, I'll repeat, great chronicle of Scottish history called the Scotichronicon, and it's actually a medieval chronicle of Scottish history. So it was written in the 15th century and illuminated in the 15th century. And so it depicts people throughout Scottish history, which of course is tied into Ireland. So it actually has, multiple Irish characters making appearances in various illuminations. But the danger of the Scotichronicon is that it might be depicting Alexander III, who was a 14th century Scottish king. He's not depicted in 14th century Scottish clothing. He's depicted in what the 15th century illuminator imagined a 14th century Scottish king would have worn, which is to say, mostly 15th century clothing with maybe a couple of notes of visual difference to indicate to the viewer that this is a king from the past, not a king from the present. But for the most part, not reflective of actual 14th century Scottish fashion. So you can't just look at a piece of art and either take the subject and say, well, this is Julius Caesar, so this is how Julius Caesar dressed. No, that's how Ghirlandaio thought Julius Caesar dressed, which is not how he dressed. So you have to understand the context of any piece of art to reference for fashion. And medieval art is especially filled with symbolism, and it's filled with allegory, and it's filled with metaphor that has nothing to do with the reality of what people were wearing at that time or in any time before. So, if you have an altarpiece and you have all these saints, the saints are always wearing elaborate clothing. It's covered in gold and jewels and what looks maybe to the modern eye like lace and embroidery and these fantastic headdresses. And they're usually carrying the sign of their martyrdom, which is not definitely a fashion accessory. Um, but but if you look in those same altar pieces, you'll see usually real people also, donors, nearly always kneeling kind of off to the side. And if you compare what the saints are wearing to what the donors are wearing, you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. The saints have been purposefully dressed in what is considered heavenly clothing, right? Holy clothing that elevates them to this other status, this other level of existence, basically, relative to the sinful mortal donor. The mortal donors are depicted in real clothing 95% of the time. The saints are not. So if you're looking at art, you just have to know the identity of each person in the piece of art, and then you can kind of decide, oh, that's real clothing, or no, that's a costume. So it can be very art is dangerous. I always tell people. So right. So that's interesting. So you're saying that 16th century, the few visual references that we have for 16th century Ireland, you have to really know the source. And so if it's Tudor artists, so English or even Welsh maybe artists depicting the Irish, then there's a goal there to depict them as savagely as possible. And so what you're saying is that the depictions might actually not be accurate. Right, 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 right. So for those who can't hear Philip, again, not my imaginary friend. He's real, I swear it. Um, what he's saying is that, you have from the 16th century, we actually have art that depicts an Englishman, a Tudor, wearing Irish what are Irish fashions, and that gentleman is depicted a general. He's depicted everything is perfect, the clothing is immaculate, the quality of the art is really high. And then if you have from that same period, we have artwork, again Tudor artwork depicting the Irish wearing those same clothes, but then those clothes on the Irish are depicted as being dirty and torn and worn. And of course, the Irish gentleman himself is not a gentleman at all, but has beast-like feet and shaggy hair and a shaggy unkempt beard. So the point is that you shouldn't use that very manipulative artwork to make a call about how the Irish actually groomed and dressed in this period, because you have to understand the context is England of the 16th century, Tudor kingdom. And, to do that, they have to assert their dominance over someone. And well, Ireland's the closest the closest thing and the most likely thing over which they could possibly assert their dominance in this era. So this is all part of it's all part of a political machine, this art. And that's a good point, Philip. Philip says you have to also look at the political context of art because, there could, the whole goal there is to position the English as being superior and the Irish as being inferior. We have someone new who just joined. Hello from the Kingdom of Darivar. For those who are just joining, if you have questions about medieval fashion, about medieval culture, 15th century, we're focusing on more or less specifically, but I will take things outside of that range. From Florence all the way up through to Ireland, just pop it in the live chat. I do actually have an expert on Irish, he doesn't like to call himself, you don't like to call yourself an expert on Irish medieval history, do you, actually? Right. Well, I think he's pretty damn knowledgeable about Irish medieval history and medieval culture. I have him on, he's collaborating, and for some reason his sound and video is not actually working in the collaboration. So if you have questions about Irish clothing, Irish culture, he's right here ready to answer your questions. Oh, we just had someone join from Queensland. Nice. Oh, not join. It's Wayne. Well, it's nice. He's just alerted us that he is from Queensland in Australia. Thank you for joining us from Australia. I was hoping we'd get some Aussies this morning. In the world, we for the most part forgotten that clothing has meaning. And has significance, whether it's social or political. We've kind of moved away to it just being an aesthetic expression, and we've forgotten about these other layers of significance. Um, Even though there still is that socioeconomic layer of significance with brand names, right? People like to, in the modern world, will display their affluence by wearing loudly branded Gucci or loudly branded Prada, or getting the latest pair of Nikes, $400 Nike sneakers with a giant swoop on the side. And that's the consequence of fabrics no longer being expensive, really, and the cost of labor being, thanks to slave factories in developing countries, dirt cheap. We've moved away from elaborate fabrics and ornaments and clothing as being the sign of affluence and wealth, or even the cut of clothing is no longer the thing that distinguishes, right? It's all about the brand. Whereas, even in Ireland, I could imagine, but people think fabric is fabric, wool is wool, silk is silk. But wool is not just wool. There are different grades of wool, my friends, and there is wool that is so fine and so silky that you could mistake it for silk. That's called doe skin. Philip, have you ever touched doe skin wool? It shines. It actually shines in the light. That's how fine doe skin is. It's usually these days used, ironically, for making riding habits for people who do dressage, I discovered. Especially ladies who do side saddle. It's used for side saddle habits. Uh, there it is. But it's if you look in certain Flemish portraits from the 15th century, especially the Arnolfini portrait. If you look at her dress, that green, you know, the Arnolfini wedding portrait, the iconic husband and wife standing next to each other with a round mirror behind them depicting Jan van Eyck. And she's got this giant green gown with the giant sleeves with the pinking, and you know it's green lined in marten squirrel, probably squirrel, gray squirrel bellies. And then her husband is standing there in this giant Burgundian style overgown with this giant beaver fur hat, and he looks kind of sickly and pale. Um, her gown. Look closely at her gown, especially find an image of that painting after restoration, after cleaning, and you will see that the wool shines. That Van Eyck manages to depict doeskin, because the Flems were masters of drapery. That was their specialty, was fabrics, depicting fabric in art. And this wool actually shines. And so I imagine that in Ireland, just like in Italy, you know, you wanted wool because it kept you warm, and it's very practical and it's very waterproof. But at the upper echelons, you would distinguish yourself skin. By contrast, your my favorite term that you introduced me to, bog trotter. Your average bog trotter would probably be wearing a wool of a less fine grade, rougher, thicker, probably not napped, with more of a nap. So there were actually people whose whole job was to just trim wool, make it nice and fine. Yeah, so for those who can't hear Philip, he actually says that the families, you know, that are like the Fitzgeralds who have the connections with Florence, it's likely that they probably came back from Florence with silk and had garments made out of it, but they're, you know, they're kind of country Irish, not city Irish. And as he says, it probably would have been stunning for an English general, you know, riding through the countryside to encounter one of these men sort of out and about barefoot, but wearing, you know, fine silk overgarments in a Florentine fashion, which, yeah, that would, that's a choice because silk and mud do not get along. Silk, mud because mud, depends what it is, has different natural pigments in it, and mud will stain silk. Chef's kiss. Like you can't get red dye stuff to be as color fast as a mud stain is on silk. So that's a statement. Well, you know, here's what I've learned through years of living history. No matter how hard you try, mud will splatter up on your fine garments. No matter what you do, no matter how high you lift your hem, no matter how carefully you tread, the mud will find a way. It always finds a way. And that's why medieval dyeing manuals are also usually also feature laundry recipes that are terrifying, horrifyingly caustic. You know, using lye and all sorts of chemicals that they obtained through natural means, but that are still powerful chemicals that will absolutely remove the stains. They will probably remove your skin too. Um, and I've been too cowardly to try some of these recipes uh, to to clean my garments, but I actually found. I wanted to bring this as an example. This is a Florentine lady's gown, and it's funny because it really looks like the Moy gown. Like if you think about the right, think about it, the Moy gown with the sleeves and the lace up bodice, right? Like this really looks like the Moy gown. Oh, sorry, I just moved the camera again. Apologize, everyone. So this is a Florentine lady's gown called a gamora. This style particularly dates to the pink wool. I walking through Tulsa, Oklahoma, And I think we walked over some freshly laid asphalt and I wasn't paying attention. And so unfortunately, I actually have some tar stains now on the hem that I've been struggling to get out. Well, struggling is not quite true. I've been fighting to get out. You can kind of see some of them there. But it also looks like the hem of my skirt got caught in the wheels of the rolling suitcase that I was using and got dragged. The rubber from the tire like marked up the skirt. So I actually have discovered that the that these very, tar is modern, but it's also not because they definitely had pitch that they use for shipbuilding and waterproofing of all sorts of things. No doubt in Ireland as well, because you definitely need waterproof things. I found that actually dish soap and persistent scrubbing and dabbing will actually get this out of wool because wool is actually very stain resistant. That is that is one of the beauties of wool is that unlike silk, which will absorb everything, even if it's not in the same room, wool will repel it. So yeah, that's another perk of wool over top of silk. Silk being uh, just very absorbent, and wool not. If it rains, wool will keep you dry. Silk will definitely not do that. We have a question. What are some ideas to include medieval fashion in our daily outfits? Um, yeah, so that's a supercut on objects for the modern medievalist. So things actually medieval objects that I actually use in my daily life. Because, why have two of one thing if you can just have one of one thing and use it for the same purpose? Um, that's a good question. Philip, can you think of any, especially from the medieval Irish kid, or even, you also have your Norse era, your Viking Dublin era ensemble, things that are would be useful for or that you could incorporate into a modern outfit. Um, I right. Yeah, where has this been my whole life? Yeah. So Philip just said, you don't realize how uncomfortable modern clothes are until you start wearing medieval clothes. And I agree so much. The layering of the linen and the wool, it's so comfortable. So in terms of, to include medieval fashion, well, for one, natural fibers, like from the get-go, incorporate natural fibers into your wardrobe. Try to avoid petrochemicals, try to avoid the synthetics, because medieval people understood two things viscerally. One, wool is naturally fire retardant. Will not, it will, even if it catches on fire, it will self extinguish. Two, linen breathes amazingly well. It whisks that moisture and heat away from your body, leads to evaporative cooling. It's highly washable. You can abuse the hell out of linen. But laundry tip for linen. Linen is actually strengthened by being wet. So if you're going to launder linen, put it in the laundry and you're going to not hand wash it. I don't have time to hand wash. So I don't hand wash my things for the most part. I hand wash my overgowns, but my linen stuff goes in the washing machine. But I use the delicate cycle. And once the basin of the washing machine has filled up with water, I stop it and let it soak because the wetter your linen is, the stronger the fibers are. So you will actually prolong the shelf life of your linen by letting it be fully soaked, there's a word here, fully hydrated. It's a better word than that. Anyway, before any agitation starts. So just pause your washing machine, give it half hour to an hour to fully soak through, and then go ahead and run the machine. And you'll get less pilling, you'll get less lint will come out, fewer fibers will be broken off in the wash cycle. So yeah, fully hydrate your linen. Silk is the opposite, though. Silk is weakened by water. In fact, all animal fibers, animal protein-based fibers are weakened by water. So that applies to modern clothes as well. I would say I agree with Philip. Working in the linen and wool layers into your wardrobe will completely revolutionize your life. And, especially if you look at first millennium fashions, you've got tunics, you've got trousers, the leg wraps the winnigus are maybe not the most convenient thing that people ever came up with, but they're effective for what they do. Um, Tunics would make a great addition to a wardrobe, I feel like, for men and women. Because, what is it basically? But I know a lot of modern men look at a tunic and think, oh, that's a dress. It might be, but you know what? It's comfortable and it's sexy. Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Let Well, I mean, so to be honest, so let me share that because that's fun. That story you just told me. So apparently in Ireland, until the 1960s, little boys were dressed in what you might recognize as a dress, but it was called a kilt, but on purpose. And actually, this is a practice that was throughout all of Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, and up into the 19th century, in fact. But in Ireland specifically, because it was the theory was that scary Irish fairies, which are nothing like your, pretty little delicate wing fairy. No, scary Irish fairies were going to come and steal your child. But if you dressed your little boy in a dress, then they wouldn't take him. So up until the 1960s, little boys were still kind of wearing dresses, which are basically like tunics. So Philip feels like he can get away with wearing tunics in Ireland and Scotland as a kind of matter of course because it's, not so foreign. Um, but I would definitely say tunics you could absolutely work into your wardrobe. And let me tell you, from coifs, because men wore coifs also. This is a winged coif. This is a very specifically a female coif, feminine coif, but men also wore kind of more of a skull cap style coif. A linen coif is such a great thing on a sunny day. Like it keeps the sun off of your head. It leads to evaporative cooling. It helps keep your hair clean. And for women, a coif like this, man, you don't have to worry about your hair. You just toss it in some braids, stuff it in the back, and put on the coif. And in midday life, and it's great. So I thoroughly encourage the wearing of headwear of all types. Um, and the brat, the brat, the wrap. I mean, that's right. Yeah, it's such a and this basically it was basically like a big was it rectangular or semicircular? Right, it's a big thing to tackle. So the Irish, for those who don't know, in Ireland, you had this massive overgarment called a brat. It's kind of a super cloak, like, it goes on top of everything else you're wearing, and it's a big piece of wool, and, the thing about most places in Europe at some point in the last 2,000 years have had a garment like this. That was just something you would wrap around yourselves, and actually Florentine women had a similar giant, massive, they were usually made of silk, called a mantello, and and it was the same idea where, it's not tailored in any real way, and you just hatch a way that it works on your body and that you can still move around. So I've been thinking of tackling that myself, the Florentine mantello. You can see in certain scenes, usually it's a religious scene, but there's actual Florentine women just out and about, kind of in the church square or something like that. And if you see, it's always like the matrons or the widows who are just kind of swaddled in this massive overgarment, and yet they're depicted walking around. So they've managed to take this bulky, ungainly length of fabric and drape it, tuck it, belt it, etc., in such a way that it still works. And it's a similar idea to the brat, although for different reasons. For the Florentine women, it's about showing that they're matrons and widows and, hiding their figures from view so that no man gets bad ideas. Whereas, in Ireland, they're trying to protect themselves from the elements. Right, right. I mean, yeah. So for those who can't hear my imaginary friend Philip, he just said Irish or even Scottish have been swaddled in a brat to sort of an unappealing non-target for cattle raiders. It's kind of it's an interesting. It's sort of the reason that in most cultures women end up getting swaddled. At first, it's all about their protection, right? And then at some point, it becomes a symbol of control. Um, and it's very interesting how that parallel seems to have happened across cultures across the world. Anytime you have a raiding culture, the response is, especially if women are the target, well, we need to hide them to make them visually unassuming, visually unappealing, whatever. And then over time, well, it's no longer a matter of practicality because obviously, in say Afghanistan, the raiding has stopped. Um, but there's still, they've decided that's the way they can control and have power over the women. So, right, right. Yeah, it's funny. So for those who, oh, there's some questions here I'll have to get to. So for those who can't hear my imaginary friend Philip from Irish medieval history, please go check out his channel. By the way, he's got lots of really cool content on on exactly what he says. His channel is much less cryptic than mine is. On Irish medieval history. Anyway, what he says is that, and this is true across many cultures in Ireland as well, that in within a clan system in any kind of tribalism, if the women are attacked by the men of a and assaulted by the men of another clan, then that somehow emasculates and takes the power away and the dignity away from the men of their clan, even though those men were not harmed in any way, shape, or form. That's why, and a trigger warning for anyone out there, a sexual assault trigger warning. I'm going to talk about law. That's why in most of medieval Europe, rape laws were not a question of a personal crime. It was a question of a property crime, right? So it's that the property of the family had been vandalized if if a woman of the household is sexually assaulted. It's not about her person being violated. It's not the same as if a man is assaulted. It's a property crime, and that's definitely a common theme throughout a lot of Europe, throughout through thousands of years. And then the men are the one whose honor has been impugned. Yeah, yeah, and that's exactly, and that's why, wedding or marriages are, the woman is literally part of a package of property that is being bestowed upon the groom's family, right? Her and I'm not, it's funny. I actually read very fascinating series of essays on first millennium, the shift from first millennium Europe to second millennium Europe, and how in the first millennium, women, you can tell in the way the laws are written that women have value in and of themselves. They are considered economic contributors in the household. They're basically considered, and this is true of most of Europe, interestingly, in the way the laws, and because laws are very local, but they all seem to read the same way. you know, if a woman is assaulted, if a man is assaulted, it's the same, and the woman is actually almost considered more valuable in the weregeld in Anglo-Saxon law, because if you kill a woman, then you're killing potential future economic contributors in the form of children, um, and and it can be reflected in whether a culture has a bride price or a dowry. So if you look at cultures that have bride prices, then that's the groom has to literally pay to get a bride because a woman is that valuable. But if there's a dowry, then the father has to have value. It's one with so much of a dowry because they're being viewed as an economic burden rather than an economic contributor, which is, and I know that Ireland, I think, retained a bride price longer than other places did. Uh, wow. Right. Right. So you would say so in so bride prices were still a going concern in 15th century Ireland, you think? Right. So y- so you didn't we're not talking because you know the not instead of dowries because of course everywhere else in the world had switched to a dowry or everywhere else in Europe had switched to a dowry. You know, where the father has to pay to get rid of the bride rather than you know, being paid to lose an economic contributor of his household. Yeah, it's very interesting. So what Philip was just saying is that a lot of these medieval, well, even ancient traditions continued in Ireland up until the 1960s. And he says that even people were even wearing, in many cases, Bronze Age style shoes. Uh, and you know, the reality is that if circumstances haven't changed to demand new kinds of footwear, why would you change the style of shoe you're wearing? Um, but you know, it's interesting that you know a lot of people think that modern footwear is so much more supportive and so much more protective, but a lot of research is now showing that our you know post medieval style footwear, especially starting with the heels, has is really destroying our bodies and causing all sorts of chronic health issues because it's warping our skeleton in ways we were never supposed to walk. We were never supposed to walk kind of propped up on support for stuff. We're supposed to have muscles to actually do that. And so there's a lot of research coming out that chronic pain is actually probably closely linked to modern style footwear, which which it would be interesting because of that shift where you said, you know, a lot of people were wearing more Bronze Age style footwear. If there was a rise in you know, chronic pain in, you know, Ireland in general, starting with that big boost of modernization. Oh, okay. Someone named Filet Mignon asked, "Can I eat a 15th century pizza?" Well, so pizza's Neapolitan. It comes from Naples originally, and the idea of taking dough and, you know, rolling it out and spreading toppings on it is not new. The Romans had a similar dish, but 15th century pizza would not have had any of the ingredients most people recognize. as as no tomatoes. Tomatoes didn't even start being consumed with any kind of real vigor in Europe until the 18th century because they're a New World plant. Peppers are also New World. It could have, you know, possibly putting, you know, something like onion and herbs and cheese on your flatbread probably would have been done. But it wouldn't have been very recognizable to a modern person as pizza. Yeah. It's like the concept of it, Phil just said, you know, sandwich was invented by the early sandwich, and it is not. The idea the idea of taking a hunk of bread and putting things on it and shoving it in your mouth is not new. The idea of taking two hunks of bread and putting something between them is also a pretty basic concept. Yeah, so Philip just said he was at a Viking reenacting. You know, one of the practitioners living history, and some tourist, as we call them, came over and he was making a sandwich and told him she didn't think he should be doing that because, of course, you know that that Vikings didn't have sandwiches. Oh my God, tourists that re oh tour the things tourists will say at living history events based on their imperfect understanding of historical culture. It's you know the thing is that living history in general, reenactment communities tend to attract people who are mm, maybe unnecessarily detail oriented in some cases, but to also be pedants in their own right. And so they like to express the superiority over you by showing, flaunting knowledge that they think they have. I've had similar experiences. Oh, what was I doing? I was Oh, no, glasses, spectacles. So, now normally I don't actually wear, spectacles when I'm doing a live stream like this, but I need to give my eyes a rest from my contacts. Still, I wore them for 6 months without changing them, and I need a break. Anyway, people assume that spectacles are not medieval. And no, they were invented in the Middle Ages, in fact. Granted, they didn't look sexy like these hot babies, but they spectacles absolutely existed from like the 13th. They were invented in Italy, unsurprisingly, in the 13th century. And you actually, if you start looking for them in portraits, you'll start seeing them. Right? Usually they're perched on someone's nose and they've got a hinge and they're just kind of sitting there. Or they're actually if you see a scribe in an illumination, they're sitting on his writing desk because they hadn't yet developed lenses for nearsightedness. They only had lenses for farsightedness. So they were basically reading spectacles. They allowed you to see things up close. And once you start looking for them, you can see them. Again, they didn't quite look like this, but there were absolutely people wearing glasses, spectacles in the Middle Ages. It was absolutely a thing. So, yeah, it's the assumptions that we in the modern world have are so much savvier and more intelligent. It's a sort of hubris that have the gods strike us down pretty shortly. Oh, no, yeah, in the so obviously I did yeah, Philip was just saying when he's doing Norse reenactment, what some of you would call Viking era reenactment, there are no spectacles then. No, there are none. There are no spectacles like I said, they were invented in the 13th century in Italy, which, it's interesting. It begs the question, well, first millennium society was not the most literate society. So, uh, it it no, no, no. No, I mean in general, like throughout Europe. It's not the most literate time. It's not that the literacy rate was not terribly high. It just wasn't. Warriors in mainland, they weren't they most lords couldn't actually read and write, right? Like the ladies of the house could because they were doing household management, but your average knight couldn't necessarily read and write. Well, your average horseman, because there are no knights in the first millennium, they just couldn't. Ireland is a weird thing in the first millennium, though. Like Ireland is this magical place in the first millennium relative to the rest of Europe. Right. Yeah. So what Philip was just saying is that Ireland benefited from being only semi-connected to Rome, and not reliant on Rome, ancient Rome, on the Roman Empire and its technologies, so that when things started going very pear-shaped in the empire, Ireland was able to just keep going because they weren't their way of life didn't depend on Rome, but also because monasticism took such root in Ireland, And actually Ireland benefited from being off at the corner because you don't have hordes of of migratory migratory tribes coming through and wreaking havoc. Uh, you know yeah, you don't have the Huns, you don't have the Tatars, you don't have the Goths, the Vandals, right? You're not subject to all of that. And it's and because England is kind of in the way, look for conquest, I sure when we can just stop here at this conveniently located island, right? So you kind of have like England is basically a barrier island for Ireland. It really is. So Ireland really benefits from that isolation when, every and also when the Justinian plague comes and basically takes care of the rest of Roman civilization in the West. It's I don't think it even gets up to Ireland because Ireland is oh, right. Yeah, so it's that's very interesting because yeah, so the Justinian plague comes through in like the 570s, I think is when it ravages Europe and it like kills 90% of the population in mainland Europe. Um, and because that's actually the Roman Senate. Most people don't realize the Roman Senate, the last time the Roman Senate met was like 563. So Rome, the everyone imagines that 476 happens, but and there's no more Roman civilization, but that's not true. The Ostrogoths just take over and they just keep everything going because the cities are still there, the engineers are still there, everyone still knows what they're doing. It's just that when the Justinian plague happens, they lose critical mass to keep the technology functioning. So that's really when the so-called Dark Ages start. Not because of the barbarian hordes, but because there's no one left to keep those aqueducts in operating order, or to keep the sewer lines going, or to repair the roads. Because you, but the there was trading town, trading post set up by the Romans in Ireland, was there? Uh, right. 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 Yeah, that completely makes sense that, you'd take advantage of the markets that are available. Um, and, so what Philip was just saying for the viewers who can't hear him, is that there were trading posts in, Roman trading posts in Ireland, but when the Roman Irish took advantage of the situation to start raid yeah, to start raiding what was formerly Roman occupied, and their trading ports turned into slave ports, which makes sense. Uh, you know, before there were machines, there were slaves. It's you know, there's a very interesting theory that without plagues to or war or famine to destroy mass mass sections of the population, there is no real need for innovation because you have people to do the work. You don't need machines to do it. But then when you have a massive drop in population, that nearly always corresponds with periods of extreme innovation because you need to fill that labor gap with something that's not human because all the humans are dead or not available anymore in the case of, the abolition of slavery in, say, the United States. But as long as it's sort of like it's why the Greeks, despite all of their brilliance. I mean, have you ever seen some of these machines that ancient Greek inventors came up with? Like Heron, yeah, there's an entire museum to them in Mytilene. Heron was this uh, 5th century inventor, 5th century BC Greek inventor, and he invented all of these amazing automatons that did amazing things, but they were only amazing things if they were for parties because the Athenians had so many slaves that they didn't need machines to do work. Posited, well, this man Heron had actually lived in a society that didn't have an abundance of slaves that actually needed to maximize the value of human labor in by minimizing it, what sort of things he may have invented in fact that could have completely altered the course of human civilization. But because he was born and raised in slave rich Athens, there was no incentive to actually use his genius to create really useful innovations, just these sort of amazing party tricks. It's, yeah, it's interesting to think the points at which civilization might have advanced so much more than when we're at today. Yeah, these are things I think about when I'm out and about walking from place to place. Yeah, great thinky thoughts with the Contessa. Okay, were there any other we've actually, as usual, we've been chatting for a long time because that's what we do when we when we connect. Were there any other questions under our Ireland meets Florence video from last week? Let's see. Let me look at the questions that I jotted down. Um, oh, there was, it was a more, were people in Florence wearing fashions from France? Were people in Ireland wearing fashions from Florence? And and I think I can from the from the continental side, the trade routes that bound Europe so heavily, sort of from the 14th century, 13th century onward, and even really starting in the 12th century, um, brought cultures into contact with other cultures. And so, you had Florentine bankers and wool merchants going and setting up shop in London and in Flanders and in Paris and in Spain and in various city states in Germany and vice versa. You had, merchants from Nuremberg setting up shop in Venice, and you have the Fitzgeralds going to Florence in the 1410s, and you've got John Hawkwood in the 14th century, who's this English mercenary who goes and just makes bank in Italy in the Italian Wars and makes such a reputation for himself that they build this massive equestrian statue in his honor when he dies. I forget what his Italian name was. Right. So so what year is that? 1490s? Right. So Philip is saying that there's and then the 1440s, one of the Gherardini goes up and sets up shop in Dublin, right? So in the 1440s we have this, a representative of the Gherardini family. Um, the Gherardini were wool, they were wool merchants, I think. Yeah, yeah. So the Gherardini were in the wool business, and they go in. I guess you said John, so that would be Giovanni probably. Sets up shop in the 1440s and gets a license to set up his storefront, as it were, in Ireland. And then in the 1490s, uh, after a siege, the English go in and find all of this silk from Florence and armor from Florence. So that really does. Yeah, go on. Silken Thomas. That's a great name. What a great. And the Irish are so great for by names. Like, you know, right. Oh, that's great. So yeah, so what Philip was just saying is that in the Tudor era, in the sort of in Henry VIII's reign, there was a Fitzgerald who had the lovely, charming sobriquet of Silken Thomas, because he was known for his elaborate silken ensembles, and apparently he like, as most people who engage in ostentation in the era, he attracted the wrong kind of attention and ended up getting captured by Henry VIII and executed at the headsman's block. So, yeah, the answer to the question, how widespread was fashion, it was most places had local flavors of fashion, but the fight as such. So, as Philip said, when the siege was when the aggressors in that siege entered the castle, they found what they identified as Florentine armor In the Italian in the inventories, and I did bring a stack of books just in case anyone asks very specific questions. This is called Lorenzo de' Medici at Home, and this is an inventory of his palazzo taken at the time of his death. And so it is literally an accounting of every single object found in every single room and its valuation. And in these sorts of death inventories, often you'll find garments that are identified by a geographic region. So a a cloak in the Neapolitan style, a hairnet in the Milanese style, a hat in the French style. Right. So even though these, every kind of local area did certainly have their own regional flavors, those flavors definitely traveled because humans are into fancy. It's 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 part of our biology. We love new things, we love to be different, we love to deck ourselves out. And that is an instinct that is not new. It's very old. And so we do know that, in Florence for a while, it became very fashionable to wear tall headdresses in the French style. And you can see it in the art, and you can read it in the chronicles, and you can read it you've got the trifecta, almost the trifecta. Unfortunately, we don't have any extant headdresses from Italy. There are no bogs in Italy. I feel like that's a failing on Italy's part. Have that they're increasingly finding are crypts in which people have been interred in their garments from life, not funerary garments, but things they actually wore. And now they're opening those crypts up because of restoration work. So they're increasingly finding extant medieval garments in Italy, 15th century specifically. So, Ireland has its bog bodies, Italy has its crypts. Yeah, no, thank God. I'm so glad for drunken Irishmen crossing the bog late at night, and so grateful for earthquakes that cause damage to churches and force them to do restoration work. Those are two terrible things to say, but that's how we feel in the living history community in general. Okay, well, Philip, I know no one can hear you except for me. I'm so sorry. Yeah. I thank you so much for joining me and for sharing all of your amazing knowledge. And I really wish everyone could have heard you because you're such a delightful speaker. But we'll definitely have to do this again, and we'll figure the technology out so that both parties can be seen and heard. And I'll chat with you on the flip side. For everyone else, thank you so much for joining for whatever parts you did. If you're watching this as a recording, pop questions in the comments and I will absolutely answer them. And if you have questions for Philip, I will make sure that he sees them and gets you questions as well. Remember, he's our Irish about material culture, martial history, and all things medieval and Irish. Okay, everyone. Well, I'm gonna go take a nice hike up Mount Apsan today because it's a beautiful, warmish day here in Korea. I hope you all have a lovely morning, afternoon, and evening wherever you are. Stay creative, guys. Bye.